Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 826, and today is August 7th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Before I get into the news today, I do want to plug my other show, The Kyle Anzalone Show. It is the top link in the show notes page, so if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that, and you're going to want to because I got some big interviews coming up. I also have some big interviews that I just did this week that I wanted to mention. On Monday, I have Michael Vallejos on the Ukraine war, Ukrainian casualties, but also I think we had a really fascinating discussion on the status of the American military and why he says the American military is in big trouble. On Wednesday, yesterday's show was Jeffrey Satz, the heroic Columbia professor, and you don't want to miss that episode. Today at 4:45 Eastern, Ron Paul Institute director Daniel McAdams returns to the show, and next week, massive interviews coming up. Liam Cosgrove on Monday, and comic Dave Smith on Thursday. So you will not want to miss any of those shows, and you certainly will want to subscribe to the channel to make sure you get those in your YouTube feed. All right, let's get into the news I have for y'all today. Starting off here, this article I wrote for the Institute on August 4th. Bipartisan Senate bill would provide $50 billion to fund Ukraine. So Senators Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, and Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Arkansas, introduced a bill that will provide $50 billion in military aid for Ukraine. The assistance is intended to fund the proxy war for another 2 years. According to The Hill, Shaheen and Murkowski are framing their legislation as giving Trump additional tools to force Putin to the negotiating table by scaling up Ukraine's military capabilities to withstand Russian attacks. Shaheen said this bill will strengthen President Trump's negotiating hand with Vladimir Putin and finally put an end to this senseless war. There is continued bipartisan resolve to sustain Ukraine's valiant fight for freedom by helping Ukraine obtain the air defense needed to protect the civilian population centers, including schools, hospitals, from Russia's relentless drone and missile attacks. And of course, a couple things that are really misleading in here. They've already given, pretty close to $100 billion now in military aid to Ukraine. It hasn't changed the situation on the ground. In fact, it's only gotten worse for the Ukrainians. And so that's just a piece of propaganda right there. And then the second important piece of propaganda, this isn't about Ukraine's freedom. Ukraine is under martial law. Their president has overstayed his election mandate by well over a year at this point. And additionally, there protests breaking out in Ukraine over the not anti-corruption laws, but rather anti-corruption laws that Zelensky is passing, looking to take back some power from the anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine. So the Hill notes, and I think this is really important, that the bill is essentially a trap for Donald Trump, as the legislation would prevent the president from halting aid shipments once the aid is approved. And so this isn't necessarily a law that is going to give Trump tools to negotiate with Putin, but rather will constrain Trump and will force him to commit to this proxy war for another 2 years. I also think this would essentially mean that Congress would have to, if not at least pass another bill that effectively endorses any ceasefire to end the war, to stop sending these weapons to Ukraine that would be a violation of the ceasefire. It would at least require the passive consent of Congress of any ceasefire deal. And you certainly know that every Democrat is going to be against it in the Senate, and even a few Republicans would be against ending the war in Ukraine. And so I think there's a real threat here that if Trump passes and signs this legislation, his hands are going to seriously be tied on any effort to end the war in Ukraine. So the bill provides $30 billion in direct military assistance, $12 billion in presidential drawdown authority funds. $3 billion in foreign military financing. It also provides money for other projects, including $1 billion for joint drone ventures between the US, Ukraine, and Taiwan. I think some of the remaining, that comes out to about 46 billion. So there's about 4 billion missing there from the total, and that is some funding to bolster American arms companies. So it's just going to be, giveaways to the American arms companies framed as helping Ukraine because it's supposed to bolster their weapons production capabilities. Because as we've highlighted on this show, that is one of the real issues here to continue to arm Ukraine. So the senators mentioned in the press release that frozen Russian assets will fund at least a part of the aid. Now, of course, the U.S. only holds about $5 billion in frozen Russian assets. I recently read that the U.S. is trying to auction off a $300 million yacht that was owned by a Russian that ended up under U.S. sanctions, and the yacht was taken. Now, my understanding is that they've already racked up some pretty significant bills maintaining, these ships are not cheap to maintain, to have and dock at some port and pay fees for that as well. Or if they move it, I guess, to a shipyard or something like that, there's going to be fees incurred there. And so I would guess that even if they do sell this thing, probably for under market value, right, it's going to go at an auction. They're going to not have that full $300 million or $250 million that they sell it for. They're only going to have a chunk of that money to give Ukraine. So it's not as if this is just $5 billion in a bank account that could simply be, sent over to a Ukrainian bank account or to an American bank account where they then buy weapons for Ukraine. And additionally, as I've said before, when the Europeans started dipping into the far larger pot of money that they hold, I think that's between $200 and $300 billion of Russian funds, that Russia is eventually going to come back for this money. And so I think this creates a situation where to end the war in Ukraine, these countries would then have to go into their own treasuries to get this money. Or maybe the more simpler way is that Russia will just extract additional concessions from Ukraine to make up for the money that was stolen from them. And so either the Ukrainians will pay the price, or this war is going to be significantly difficult to wind down when Congress has to approve $5 billion in U.S. taxpayer money goes to Russia to make up for the Russian money that we stole. So during the 2024 campaign, Trump was extremely critical of Biden's White House for providing Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars in U.S. military assistance. Last year, Congress passed a $60 billion aid package for Ukraine. That was about 14 months ago, so it seems that expecting $50 billion to go 2 years is a bit of a stretch. Then Senator J.D. Vance voted against that bill. He's of course now in the White House, so it'll be interesting to see maybe how much sway, how much he could argue to try to get the Trump administration to not go along with this legislation. However, Trump has become frustrated with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is refusing to end the war unless Ukraine agrees to territorial concessions. Trump now appears to be pressuring Moscow by placing sanctions on Russia's trading partners, tariffs, I guess, too, rather than seeking to significantly escalate military support for Ukraine. Now, this is, I found to be an interesting story. U.S. to buy $3.5 billion in missiles. Some will go to Ukraine. So the Pentagon signed a $3.5 billion contract for AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missiles. Their AMRAAM is the acronym there. Some of the missiles will be distributed among 19 countries, including Ukraine. So a statement from the Department of Defense explained Raytheon will be paid $3.5 billion for an unspecified number of missiles. It adds that some of the missiles will be sent to Ukraine. This contract involves foreign military sales, which is, weapons that we're going to distribute to Denmark, Belgium, Japan, Netherlands, Canada, Finland, Germany, Hungary, Spain, Poland, Sweden, Taiwan, Lithuania, the United Kingdom, Australia, Switzerland, Ukraine, Israel, and Kuwait. So the AMRAAM is fired from most American and NATO aircraft. Additionally, the missiles can be fired from the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, the function as a surface-to-air missile. And so this has been used as an air defense system in Ukraine. I'm guessing that's what Ukraine would get them for, although they could be fired by the F-16s we sent to Ukraine as well. The missiles will also be sent to Israel. The U.S. used AIM-120s to shoot down Iranian drones and in defense of Israel during the 12-day war in June. Raytheon is expected to complete the delivery in 2031. The Pentagon signed a similar $1.2 billion contract for AIM-120s last year with Raytheon. It's unclear to me how Ukraine is going to pay for these, or if Ukraine is going to pay for these. The way I initially read it, I was thinking it sounds to me like this is going to be a either Europeans buying them for Ukraine, or maybe American military aid paying for it. Now, we do have the first announcement of NATO states in that Trump announced NATO states were going to buy $10 billion in weapons for Ukraine. We now have 4 NATO states agreeing to buy $1 billion in U.S. weapons for Ukraine. I wrote this one for the Institute on August 5th. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands announced they would buy $1 billion in weapons for Ukraine from the U.S. Copenhagen is pledging to buy $500 million in arms that will be matched by the 3 Scandinavian countries. I believe Sweden is second on that list at $275 million. The Wall Street Journal reports this is the first of several weapon sales to Ukraine paid for by NATO members that will be announced this summer. NATO and President Donald Trump recently unveiled the scheme to send Ukraine $10 billion in U.S. weapons funded by Europe and Canada. However, several European countries have announced they will not participate in the program. Ukrainian President Zelensky celebrated the announcement. He wrote on X, "We've already had commitments from the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, over $1 billion for American weapons that Ukraine will receive. Thank you. This cooperation with NATO countries will continue." The Ukrainian leader also said he had a productive conversation with President Donald Trump. Zelensky and Trump spoke about adding new sanctions on Russia. According to Reuters, the scheme allows for countries that donate weapons to Ukraine to have priority access to receiving replacement arms from the U.S. I believe one of these countries was potentially sending a Patriot missile, either missiles or a battery to Ukraine. So this, is going to get interesting because there seems to be a real shortage of Patriots on the market, and I think the Nets system is only set to go out 8 months from now, and I'm not sure if it means the next one's coming out 8 months after that, but it'll be a good amount of time, and so if countries are saying they're patriots, they're going to get bumped up on the list of countries to receive them, which means other countries, I'm thinking Taiwan, are going to be bumped down further on the list, and it's going to take them longer to get their systems. All right, next up here, this one from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com, published on August 4th. Russia says it is no longer bound by moratorium on deployment of INF missiles. And so as the nuclear saber rattling, as the tensions have increased between the US and Russia, and this is something I talk about quite a bit with Professor Satz on the interview I did with him yesterday on the Kyle Anzalone show. But I really want to note this here, that Russia is saying this, and this, I think, means any attempt to re-enter into an agreement similar to the INF treaty will be far more difficult. And so this could be an increase of land-based nuclear potential, missiles that could carry nuclear weapons on the European continent coming up soon. That's a troubling development. Next up here, this one again from Dave DeCamp on August 6th at antiwar.com. Trump raises India tariffs to 50% over imports of Russian oil after Witkoff meets with Putin. So President Trump on Wednesday signed an executive order raising tariffs on India to 50% over New Delhi's import of Russian oil, a step he took right after his envoy Steve Witkoff held a meeting with Russian President Donald Trump. The president said that the tariffs on India would go into effect on August 27th and that other countries could face similar measures if they continue to purchase Russian oil. The move comes ahead of the August 8th deadline Trump set for Russia to end the war in Ukraine or face sanctions and secondary tariffs on its trading partners. So it just goes to show Trump really does not understand what he's doing here. You know, he's moving deadlines around. Even if the 50-day deadline didn't seem like a practical amount of time, that more time would have been needed to end the war in Ukraine. Certainly, if there was any potential, any desire for the Russians to engage with that timeline, when Trump accelerated to 8 to 12 days, August 8th, that's tomorrow, to end the war, I'm sure Russia became almost wholly uninterested in negotiations with Russia with the U.S. in an attempt to meet that deadline, just because it's impossible. And then when Trump is already placing these secondary tariffs that he was threatening to do if Russia didn't meet the deadline before the deadline is met, then this is just absurd and is making negotiations impossible. So after imposing the tariffs, Trump also said that great progress was made during the Witkoff-Putin meeting. And I'm sure to the Russians, this just seems like an absolute slap in the face. If there was progress made, that Trump would immediately go and place tariffs on one of Russia's main trading partners. All right, next story up here. Trump administration won't provide disaster relief to states and cities that boycott Israel. Now, this policy has apparently been walked back, although it's, from my understanding, it was walked back like 50%. And so sometimes by the government, that just means it really wasn't walked back at all. But the Trump administration had said that states and cities would not receive disaster funding to prepare for national disasters if they choose to boycott Israeli companies. And the document said that in order to receive funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which falls under the Department of Homeland Security, states must certify that they will not engage in discriminatory prohibited boycott. And of course, this is absolutely disgusting and just is destroying the America First movement that Trump put together, because really he is an Israeli first president. All right, moving on here. It shows Congress is Israel first too. House Speaker Mike Johnson visits illegal settlement in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And so that's right. The Speaker of the House sent Congress home early, said, we don't want to vote on this Epstein stuff. I'm sending everybody home early. Well, home for Mike Johnson is apparently the West Bank. And many members of Congress followed him to Israel. I think about 20 Republicans went on an AIPAC-sponsored trip. So Mike Johnson traveled to the West Bank on Monday to visit a Jewish settlement considered illegal under international law, a strong showing of support for Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. According to Ynet, the trip was organized by the Yeshida Council Israeli Settler Lobby in coordination with the U.S. Israeli Education Association, a pro-Israel advocacy group. The trip made Johnson the first sitting House Speaker to visit the West Bank. During his visit to the Ariel settlement in the central West Bank, Johnson declared that the Jewish people had the right to the Palestinian territory, which he referred to as Judea and Samaria, using the biblical names for the region. But really, this is a show of support for Israeli annexation, because those are the terms that Israel uses to assert their sovereignty over the territory. So every corner of this land is important to us. It is an integral part of our faith, and therefore the significance for us is great. We stand entirely by your side, Johnson said, according to a statement from the Settlements Municipal Authority. Scripture teaches us that the mountains of Judea and Samaria were promised to the Jewish people, and they belong to them by right. But many people around the world do not see it like that. They label this the occupied territories or the West Banks or any other name. And so he is not using property rights that the people who have lived there for generation after generation should continue to be able to live on their land, but rather he is saying that, because the Bible, in his interpretation of it, says that this land was promised to the Jews. That means that the modern state of Israel gets to kick their current inhabitants off the land, commit ethnic cleansing, annex the territory, treat the native Palestinians as third-class citizens. So Johnson was joined on his delegation by Representative Michael McCall, Nathaniel Moran, and Michael Cloud, and Claudia Tinney, all Republicans, as well as Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her father, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, former Governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee. Both Johnson and Huckabee are known for their Christian Zionist views and their belief that God gave historic Palestine to the modern state of Israel, a theology that is rejected by the majority of Christian denominations. During the visit, the chair of the Yesha Council asked the U.S. politicians for their support in advancing the goal of Israeli annexation of the West Bank, and there is no sign during the visit. Johnson raised the issue of 2 U.S. citizens who were murdered by Jewish Israeli settlers last month, or the recent settler violence against Tabeth, a West Bank village that is populated entirely by Christians. And so, they say this is about their faith, but then when the Israeli settlers are abusing Christians, suddenly they don't care. All right, next up here, President J Street says he has been convinced Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The president of the U.S.-based liberal Zionist advocacy group J Street has said that he has been convinced that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Jeremy Ben Amal wrote in a newsletter published on his Substack on Sunday. Until now, I have tried to deflect and defend when challenged to call this a genocide. I have, however, been persuaded rationally by legal and scholarly arguments that international courts will one day find Israel has broken the International Genocide Convention. He said that he likely wouldn't use the term to describe Israel's actions in Gaza, but that he would no longer argue against those who do. His newsletter came a few days after he appeared on Pod Save America and argued against the idea that Israel was committing genocide. And so this is interesting that even top Israeli lobbyists appear to have been swayed on this issue. All right. Moving on, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 6th. Former Israeli Prime Minister warns Israel becoming leper state, losing GOP support. So, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett warned that Tel Aviv is losing American support. He said Israel was increasingly viewed as a leper state and losing support in the Republican Party. So in a Facebook post published on Tuesday, Bennett wrote, "Truth alert, Israel's status in the United States is collapsing. The Democratic Party has long not been with us. The Republican Party that once could be trusted to support Israel, we are losing it as well." Polling shows a growing number of Americans are against Israel's military occupation in Gaza. The majority view Israel unfavorably. However, Tel Aviv maintains bipartisan support among U.S. political leadership. A recent vote on cutting $500 million in military aid only gained 6 votes in the House. Bennett notes that while Tel Aviv receives unconditional support from President Donald Trump, young Republicans are turning on Israel. Although part of the Trump administration still supports Israel first and foremost, thanks to President Trump himself, but many in the right-wing environment in the United States, including in the MAGA movement, are moving away from Israel. The younger generation, even the Republican, is far less a fan of Israel. In April, a survey from Pew found 50% of Republicans under the age of 50 had an unfavorable view of Israel. Bennett said the trend in the United States is to view Israel as a leper country. The former prime minister made his dire assessment after spending 10 days in the U.S. Israel has placed Gaza under near total blockade, creating a humanitarian crisis. Bennett explained, even those who were our friends find it difficult to defend the country of Israel. As a solution to managing Israel's image crisis, Bennett suggested Netanyahu place a high priority on developing propaganda rather than ending the conflict in Gaza. And so, his solution isn't even treat the Palestinians better. It's just get better PR. All right, next up, another article I wrote for the Institute, this one on April 4th. Former Israeli senior officials asked Trump to force Netanyahu to end war in Gaza. Hundreds of former Israeli officials, including past heads of the Mossad and Shin Bet, sent President Donald Trump a letter asking him to force the Israeli Prime Minister to end military operations in Gaza. The letter said that Hamas no longer posed a threat to Israel. Stop the war, the letter to President Trump from Commanders for Israel's Security said. The group's acronym is CIS. Israel's largest group of former IDF generals and Mossad, Shin Bet, police, and diplomatic corps equivalents. We urge you to end the war, Gaza war. You did in Lebanon. Time to do it in Gaza as well. Now, the war in Lebanon really isn't over, but the military operations have significantly curtailed. So, this would be a step in the right direction, and Trump went along with this letter. The letter adds, your credibility with the vast majority of Israeli arguments augments your ability to steer Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government in the right direction, end the war, return the hostages, stop the suffering, and forge a regional international coalition that helps the Palestinian Authority, once reformed, to offer Gazans and all Palestinians an alternative to Hamas and its vicious ideology. Washington provides Tel Aviv with military aid and weapons, and the U.S. regularly pressures allies to refrain from diplomatic actions against Israel. The U.S. has paid for 70% of Israel's post-October 7th wars, which include major operations in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as hundreds of airstrikes on Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. Could throw Yemen in there as well. Trump has refused to leverage American support for Israel with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to get Tel Aviv to agree to a ceasefire. In March, Netanyahu broke the ceasefire that was brokered by Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff in January. If Trump had forced Netanyahu to comply with the agreement, the remaining Israeli hostages would have been released, and the onslaught in Gaza would have come to an end. CIS explained to Trump that the only way to secure the release of the hostages is through an agreement with Hamas. The IDF has long accomplished the two objectives that could be achieved by force: dismantling Hamas's military formations and governance. The third and most important can only be achieved through a deal: bring all the hostages home. The letter was first reported by the Jerusalem Post on Sunday. The same day, an Israeli official said Netanyahu believed a deal with Hamas is not possible, and he would use decisive military action to free the remaining captives. In their letter, the senior officials argued that if Tel Aviv ended operations in Gaza, Hamas would no longer present a strategic threat. It says, it is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer possesses a strategic threat to Israel, and our experience tells us that Israel has all it takes to deal with residual terror capabilities, remotely or otherwise. Chasing remaining senior Hamas operatives can be done later. Our hostages can't wait, they explained. It doesn't seem like their words are being heard by the Trump administration. I want to move on to this story now. Actually, let's start with this one I wrote for the Institute on August 6th. Hamas does not want to govern Gaza, refuses to disarm. So in an interview with Saudi media, a top Hamas official said that the group wanted to give up governing Gaza once the Israeli occupation ends, but is unwilling to disarm. So the official said, "We do not want to be a part of any administrative arrangements related to the management of Gaza's affairs, and we will not participate in either the government or the ruling party." Additionally, he said that Hamas did not want to have any rule at border crossings or escorting aid deliveries. Hamas does not seek to be a part of any arrangements related to managing the crossings or supervising the entry of aid. Israel has previously attacked Hamas's police force when it was escorting aid deliveries. The lack of an escort for aid trucks has led to starving Palestinians rushing aid shipments. The Israeli forces have massacred Palestinians attempting to get aid off of the trucks. The Hamas official also ruled out disarmament. The problem has never been weapons. There's no talk of disarmament now. The Palestinian people, along with Hamas, are subjected to unprecedented pressures as a result of the Israeli aggression, and we are responding positively to all initiatives and pressures aimed at halting the aggression. So, Israeli sources have ruled out reaching an agreement with Hamas to end the military operations in Gaza and release the remaining hostages held by the Palestinian groups. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning to order the occupation of all the Gaza Strip and free the remaining hostages. The Hamas official said that Netanyahu's escalation will endanger the remaining living hostages, saying any attempt to invade the Strip will expose the lives of Israeli prisoners held by Hamas to unprecedented dangers. All right, next up here, let's talk a little bit more about Netanyahu's announcement. All right, this article I wrote at the 5th at the Institute. Netanyahu favors full military takeover of Gaza, even if it leads to death of hostages. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is willing to endanger the lives of the 20 living Israeli captives in Gaza to achieve a full military control over the Strip. The Times of Israel reports that Netanyahu met with senior security officials on Tuesday to hammer out Gaza war plans and reportedly came out in favor of the military taking control of the entire enclave, even if it meant that the remaining hostages could be harmed or executed by Hamas. Palestinian groups still hold 50 Israeli captives who were taken on October 7th. 20 are still believed to be alive. Last week, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas released videos of 2 Israeli captives who appear extremely malnourished. A Hamas official told Saudi media that Netanyahu's escalation will endanger the lives of the remaining hostages. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Azal Zamir opposes Netanyahu's proposal. A report in Ynet on Monday explained that the Prime Minister's inner circle had decided on escalation, and if Zamir opposed the policy, he could resign. The official said, "The die is cast. We are going for full occupation of the Gaza Strip. There will be activity also in the areas where the hostages are being held, and if it doesn't suit the IDF Chief of Staff, he can resign." Tuesday's meeting was attended by Netanyahu, Defense Minister Israel Katz, Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, and IDF Operations Directorate Head Major General Isaac Cohen. Following the meeting, the Prime Minister's office released a statement saying the IDF is prepared to implement any decision made by the Security Cabinet. Now, I also wrote an article for the Institute as a follow-up at the Libertarian Institute on August 6th. Hostage families oppose Netanyahu's plan to occupy Gaza. Trump says it's up to Israel. So the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is supporting a proposal for full occupation in Gaza, even if it endangers the lives of the remaining captives held by Hamas. The plan is opposed by some family members of the hostages. President Donald Trump appeared to give Netanyahu a green light for expanding Israeli control over Gaza. The Times of Israel reports that Netanyahu met with his senior security cabinet on Tuesday and made the decision. Vicky Colin, the mother of 2 hostages and the aunt of 2 others, denounced Netanyahu's plan, saying, "The government is ruining all of our values. We're hearing talk about conquering Gaza. That will be a death sentence for our hostages." The brother of one hostage said, "We can't give ourselves permission to endanger the hostages through military operations. We have to get them out alive, those who survived until now." Hamas has offered to release the hostages and give up governing Gaza if Tel Aviv agrees to end the occupation of the Strip. Netanyahu has rejected that offer and maintains that Israel will not agree to a permanent ceasefire, and Hamas must also agree to disarm. A Hamas official told Saudi media on Tuesday that if Israel expands military operations in the Strip, most of the hostages will die. While over 100 captives were freed by previous prisoner exchanges, efforts to free the hostages with military action have led to the death of Israelis. Still, Trump appears to have given Netanyahu the green light to occupy all of Gaza. President Donald Trump was asked on Tuesday whether he supported a reported plan for Israel to escalate in Gaza with the goal of fully occupying the Palestinian territory, and said it was pretty much up to Israel. So Trump does say that he's concerned about the starvation crisis in Gaza, but it's pretty clear at this point that Israel is responsible for that. It seems they're again going with the plan that was first put in place maybe in 2024 by the Biden administration that saw airdropped aid be lifted into Gaza, but that's turning deadly again. A Palestinian nurse was already killed. One last thing I want to mention here, I think this is kind of an interesting story to just keep tabs on as it develops. You know, we've talked about the increase in Israeli soldier suicides, and now we have a mental health unit in the IDF saying that Israelis seeking treatment for mental health trauma is up 1,000%. Absolutely startling, but I guess unsurprising when you're having all these young men thrown into combat with little training and being a part of a genocide. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. Check out the interviews I did earlier this week with Michael Vallejos and Jeffrey Satz. And then check out today's Watch Live, if you can, interview with Daniel McAdams. And of course, don't miss the great comic Dave Smith coming on the show next week. Talk to you soon.